I'm just watching. Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Rosalind Layton, founder of China Tech Threat. We study the problems of technology produced by the People's Republic of China and suggest policy solutions to protect the security, privacy, and prosperity of Americans. I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion about the question, let the chips fall, at BIS. BIS is the Bureau of Industry and Security, an agency within the United States Department of Commerce. Today's event is especially relevant because the White House, as many of you are aware, released a 250-page report of the results of their 100-day supply chain review. It's extremely relevant to BIS in many ways, and let me just outline a couple. First of all is its focus on China. The White House notes on page 60 of the report that, quote, China is avoiding the transparency requirements of the WTO subsidy regime and is likely seeking to avoid future WTO dispute settlement. Another prominent example comes on page 62 of the report, which focuses on YMTC, the Chinese state-owned semiconductor memory fabrication plant that I and others on this discussion today have warned about beginning late last year. Now, another point made in the report relates to China's reliance on American semiconductor manufacturers. The report delves into, the report will note the importance of export controls with, quote, the administration should target and implement export controls on critical semiconductor equipment because such controls will protect U.S. national security interests by limiting advanced semiconductor capabilities in countries of concern while enabling continued leadership of semiconductor sector. So it's very telling that this report is released today. It will likely give us some ideas of where the White House is going to go on the nominee to head the BIS. I would expect someone to implement the policy strategy laid out in this report. As we get underway today, please feel free to go to chinatechthreat.com where you'll find our the section on the future of BIS, where we feature profiles of the candidates to lead this important agency, along with news, analysis, and commentary. And through our discussion today, you can post your comments and questions on Twitter using the China Tech Threat handle and the hashtag Future of BIS. And please be sure to follow us on Twitter if you haven't already. And I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers so we can learn more about this important agency and the critical issues associated with it. So let me begin. We have Stephen Eagle, who is an expert in global innovation policy. This is How Nations Innovate, How They Get Smarter and Better. He's the author of Innovation Economics, A Race for Global Advancement, published by Yale University Press in 2012. And Stephen is the vice president at ITIF, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. It's a think tank ranked globally for its role in science and technology policy. Be sure to check out Stephen's paper from earlier this year called Moore's Law Under Attack, the Impact of China's Policies on the Global Semiconductor Innovation. Some of the points that he notes in this report are quite relevant with what White House announced today. Particularly, he noted the problem of the lack of transparencies of subsidies. And the report details various discriminatory practices used by China to promote their inferior innovators and how this harms outcome for U.S. and other market-led economies. And other problems he's highlighted are artificial overcapacity, predatory pricing, and disrespect of intellectual property rights. And Stephen has estimated that this is on order of U.S. losing out of something like 5,000 patents a year because of these policies. I'm also very pleased to have Will Hunt. Will Hunt is joining us today. He performs statistical and other quantitative analyses of the semiconductor supply chain issues. He's earning his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. And Will comes to us today from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. This is a policy research organization inside of the university, which is doing data-driven analysis on advanced technologies. And we want to highlight kudos to CSET, which is footnoted in the White House report. Very impressive. We're going to reference Will's paper from March of this year called China's Progress in Semiconductor Manufacturing Equipment, Accelerants and Policy Implications. This is posted on China Tech's website, as are all the other papers from today's authors. And I think some key points that Will underscores here, which is that China is dependent on 3 countries for advanced chips and chip-making equipment, notably the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. But as we can see, and we'll learn further, that China wants to indigenize their semiconductor capability. And Will describes the 5 factors which are the drivers for China's potential, and notes similar, just as Japan in the 1980s, China is in a similar position today, and Japan, over a 15-year period with sustained effort, was able to catch up to the US in a number of important areas of the semiconductor industry. So this paper explains those various factors and makes a number of observations. And finally, we have Emily de la Pubiera. She is a linguist and a policy analyst. She's analyzed as primary source Chinese language materials to provide insight on geopolitical and technological and economic issues to help policymakers understand global change. And she's a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which produces actionable and multidisciplinary research to inform foreign and security policy. Emily has just published Defusing Civil-Military Fusion, the Need to Identify and Respond to Chinese Military Companies. Now, this report is a systems-level analysis of U.S. policy towards China, showing that the siloed piecemeal approach of the U.S. and how it has fallen short of China's grand strategy for global power, which integrates civil, military, and commercial sectors. And importantly, this report addresses perhaps the trillion-dollar policy question, is why did it take the Department of Defense some 21 years to publish a list of Chinese military-linked companies? This was something from the 1999 NDAA, which we didn't see until last year. So I commend you to all these excellent reports, and I'm thrilled to have these great speakers with me today. And we're going to be talking about the Bureau of Industry and Security. BIS will be the abbreviation that we'll use. BIS has basically 3 sort of functions. One is leadership in strategic technologies. The other is the treaty compliance for weapons of mass destruction. And then finally, the export controls for dual-use products and services. And for those who don't know, that term dual use has to do with commercial items which could also be used in military applications. And export controls are concerned with regulating the use of those so that they are traded for their intended user and use. So for those who may not be familiar with that area, that's what we're going to talk about and what the new head of the BIS will be doing. So I wanted to ask any of our panelists today if you had any reactions about the White House report. Obviously, we're going to be delving into a number of areas, but before we got started, I wanted to just give our panel a chance to respond. Any thoughts about today and the White House report?
Well, I just, volunteer that, it's
Sure.
really an important starting point as the administration develops a comprehensive across the whole of government strategy to deal with the China technology strategy. Export controls, as we'll talk about, certainly has an important place in this. This might actually provide a good moment for the U.S. to kind of stop, reset, take a look at the kind of export control policies we've been enacting over the past several years, and now kind of reframe them into a comprehensive package. I'd also like to mention that, the positive element, I think, of the supply chain review is that it does confirm something which came directly out of ECRA, which was the 2018 Export Control Reform Act, which said, quote, export controls should be coordinated with the multilateral export control regimes of foreign nations, where export controls that are multilateral are most effective. And they should be tailored to focus on those core technologies and other items that are capable of being used to pose a serious national security threat to the U.S. and its allies. I think if that's the framing we use going forward, that would be constructive.
Well, thank you for that, Stephen. I think your report does an excellent job of describing how that would work. And it's important that the White House recognizes that. And if anything, I think that was what I think some people were promised was going to be the Biden administration differentiator, that they would be leading on a kind of multilateral approach. And if in fact that's the case and that can work here, I think that will be certainly a benefit. So of course we'll be watching for that. Will, anything that you wanted to add on it? I mean, obviously you've certainly pointed out some of the suboptimality of the export regime. We'll certainly have a chance to get into it, but any quick reactions as we get started?
I thought the chapter on semiconductor supply chains was very strong. I think it's impressive. As Stephen said, it really gives a sense of how global the supply chains are and how important it is going to be to cooperate with allies on export controls. So I was pretty pleased with the report.
That's great. Well, thank you. And also, again, kudos to you. Your CSET is footnoted. Emily, now you are, you were looking at this in a big picture of, if I might say, great power competition, or perhaps you use another framework at FDD. But how do you see this in terms of the big picture security, U.S.-China policy? Where does this fall in your, in your assessment?
I mean, I'd absolutely agree that this is a fantastic early step in terms of the administration going out there and saying these things matter. At a very basic level, supply chains matter. Multilateralism in working on supply chains, semiconductors competing with China's industrial policy, all of these things are critical. I'm biased because I think Chinese industrial policy is the most important and interesting thing in the world. And so I expect, a highly nuanced, in-depth analysis of China's industrial policy on semiconductors in anything on that subject I'm going to read. So obviously, I'm going to find that certain things come short or fall short. But there are just like two really critical elements of China's approach that there are signs of them in this report, and I just hope that they are incorporated with the competitive nuances that they entail into the administration's moves working forward. And those include, first and foremost, China's approach to semiconductors and to industrial policy writ large doesn't just center around subsidies and subsidies that evade trade laws. It certainly does. That's a huge part of it. But China also actively works to weaponize integration. And part of that entails explicitly encouraging companies to quote unquote go out, to integrate into the global system in order to obtain research and development through partnerships or research and development centers, but also to obtain positions of leverage within industry chains. And that whole approach changes the framework through which we have to look at supply chains and look at China's role within them, because it's not just what is China doing at home, it's how is China integrated, and do we actually understand where they're invested and what vulnerabilities or opportunities that presents. And the corollary of that, which is the other point, is that the report does such an excellent job of identifying where China's dependence on the U.S. is in semiconductors. But Beijing is also keen to point out the flip side of that, to point out that U.S. dependence on certain upstream inputs actually potentially provides more leverage than the reciprocal, because everything depends on the upstream, whereas the downstream is it's downstream. And something might be more advanced, but the more fundamental or rudimentary is critical for it. And so we need to look across the whole supply chain is the very short of it. And I desperately want that to be incorporated into this administration's response.
Well, thank you for that. That is really a fulsome assessment, just an hour after 250 pages was delivered. So I really thank you. And also I appreciate that systems approach that you're bringing. It is something that we try to do at China Tech Threat. And our critique in general of U.S.-China policy has been that it is so piecemeal that we are kind of, missing forest for the trees. It's, restricting one small thing, and then, that same entity may be able to find a workaround, for example. So, I'm really pleased to see your work out there where you're drawing the links, you're bringing in Chinese Academy of Sciences, you're bringing in the ownership, the evasion, a lot of these other elements. And so I know we're going to have a great discussion today. So, well, thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to Will, I'm going to come back to you. So let's, we're going to talk a bit about BIS. And, we have a lot of viewers today, and not everybody is going to be familiar with this particular, which most people probably haven't heard of, this little corner of the Department of Commerce, which has suddenly become, one of the very hot seat in government. And so I have called it sort of the most important agency you've never heard of. But maybe would you tell us, why do you think this agency is so critical, and why now?
Yeah, definitely. So as you started to say at the beginning of the talk, BIS's biggest responsibility is obviously implementing and enforcing export controls, specifically on dual-use technologies. And it just turns out that dual-use technologies, that includes semiconductors, AI, biotechnology. So really some of the most important technologies in the world today. And China obviously understands just how important those technologies are, as Emily was speaking to. And they've been investing very heavily in tech transfer and trying to build up more indigenous capacity in those areas. Fortunately, the United States, and I think this is highlighted in the White House report, the United States and US allies have a lot of incumbency advantages within these supply chains generally. And that enables export controls to do some very powerful things. And I'll draw out maybe two different ways that export controls are maybe especially important and useful. The first way is that this can use export controls to prevent bad actors in China or elsewhere from using these technologies in problematic ways. So export controls on Huawei is probably the paradigmatic example of this, where because of Huawei's involvement with human rights violations and IP theft and so on, the US government decided to cut off their access to semiconductors. And that's been very damaging. It's a very powerful policy tool that basically cut off their 5G and smartphone businesses because China doesn't have that indigenous capacity to make their own leading edge chips. And just, if you can bear with me, I want to pull out a second way that export controls are very useful. And I think this is actually even more important in some ways. But this can export control technologies, as Emily was saying, that are upstream in the supply chain to ensure that adversaries aren't able to develop their own indigenous capacities. So, for example, the United States has had a policy for many years of keeping China a couple of years behind the leading edge in semiconductor manufacturing. And one key way that we do that is by controlling the specialized SME and advanced materials that you need in order to manufacture leading edge chips. So because Chinese firms can't access those inputs, they stay dependent on the United States and our allies. And that's a key reason why we're able to implement end user and end use controls effectively. So that's just to wrap up. Basically, there are two really important uses of export controls right now. One is that ability to cut off countries or companies from problematic end uses, but also the ability to kind of shape supply chains through upstream export controls. And those are just very, very powerful capabilities at a time when China is increasingly the US-China competition is so centered on these dual-use technologies.
So, Will, thank you for that answer. Let me add, since you brought up Huawei, and it's a company my colleagues and I have been studying since 2005. And, arguably the U.S. policy of Huawei goes back to President Obama's administration. And, I think that there was quite concern noting its close relationship to the Chinese military. And what we would, might observe with placing Huawei on the entity list is that the danger of the danger that has been put for users of this equipment with their data because of Huawei getting capability to these kinds of next generation technologies, how it can get back to the Chinese military. And for that reason, that it's not usable for sensitive communications, is not usable for many kinds of communications. I know, for example, different kind of companies with sensitive intellectual property, they don't want to have their equipment on Huawei networks, for example, because the patents, the sensitive information is at risk. And this is also, with individuals with sensitive information. So if anything, the critique was the U.S. took too long to act on Huawei. I will point out one candidate running for this BIS who's been mentioned as a leader, Kevin Wolf, who's a veteran of BIS. He actually noted that the U.S. could have gone even further by sanctioning Huawei overall, that the entity list in some ways perhaps has a shortcoming because it is defined for a specific period. It's a kind of a even though it is powerful, but it still has, it can come to an end. It can be reversed at findings for different reasons. So, there are good reasons why a nation would use export controls when, in fact, the security of its people is at risk. So, and I think that, this it took a lot of different parts of government to come together, both parties, to finally make this action with Huawei in 2018. There's certainly many other companies we're going to talk about today, but let's, Stephen, I want to shift to you because you're really a semiconductor policy expert, and you've watched this evolution for a long time. And really, the role of BIS, it's changed dramatically in recent years, notably from congressional reforms, as you alluded to, on the ECRA, Export Control and Reform Act in 2018. How and why did this happen? And where are we now in your view?
So, I think what's really happened is that, especially over the past 5 years, in both Congress on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, and through to administrations from both parties, there is an increasing recognition and understanding of the threat that China's unfair, what we call innovation mercantilist practices pose to the U.S. economy and those of like-minded nations. As Emily alluded to, there's absolutely no question that China deploys an all of the above strategy for foreign technology acquisition. And that, of course, started 20 years ago with forced JV, forced tech transfer, IP transfer requirements as a condition of market access. Over the past decade, that's evolved into a more sophisticated strategy where China realized, instead of parking hundreds of millions in T-bills, why don't we use those funds to go out and actually acquire U.S. and other foreign companies in international marketplaces? So that's where you had the evolution of China's National IC Integrated Circuit Plan, which is now $170 billion of government subsidies, with have both gone to stand up Chinese players like YMTC, or to actually try and go out in international markets and buy companies like Micron or ISS. And where that doesn't fare to try and buy it or force its transfer, they try and steal it through intellectual property theft or cyber theft. So there's a recognition of these challenges that led to a series of reforms starting in 2018, not just on export controls with ECRA, but also we had the FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, so looking at both controlling inbound foreign direct investment on the inbound side, as well as export controls on the outbound side. So this actually led to a lot more being put on BIS's plate. In ECRA, for instance, Congress charged the agency at BIS with leading an interagency effort to identify emerging and foundational technologies that are quote essential to the national security of the United States and might require the introduction of new or stronger export controls. We're here, emerging technologies were defined as non-mature technologies, and foundational technologies as kind of as mature ones. The BIS has since been leading a process of public consultation with stakeholders can find what these things are. So that's added much to its plate. And of course, at the same time, you have the request in ECRA that some of the American approach try and not be unilateral, but try to be multilateral. So that calls upon the agency then to go out to international stakeholders and try, and not just in Wassenaar, but in other forums, to try and develop an effective multilateral control regime. Because if the United States tries to go along, in my opinion, with its export control strategy, it will only do long-term damage to its own semiconductor and other high-tech industries.
Thank you for that. So well, obviously, this is one of the key points you make around the need for cooperation. So, Emily, I'm going to come to you now. One of the critiques of BIS has sort of been, well, the mission, of course, is, and it's essentially a balance between industry and security, and that within that tussle, somehow that industry wins out. Now, maybe there are people who say, well, security wins out. But because there is perhaps a conflict, that maybe there's a better place for this agency, whether within the State Department or Treasury Department, Defense Department, what have you, perhaps even reinvented in another way. So I'm curious around your take of that assessment, and whether can we balance these things? This is an ongoing policy discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I entirely agree with that critique. I think these are difficult things to balance, and by and large, industry does win out over security. And that also ultimately means the American industry does lose out in the long term, because it is in industry's long-term interest to protect its security in the immediate. I don't think that gets resolved by moving BIS to Treasury or the State Department. I think that problem is pretty endemic across a lot of the government, and shifting entities around or adding on new mechanisms within new departments doesn't seem to resolve the problem. I do think that the most strategic thing that the US government could do would be to set up a new body, a superordinate body that is tasked with competing with China, and doing so in a way that focuses on the emerging industrial revolution, and has that as its mandate and can do that across sectors, and without being caught by the path dependencies or the existing biases of pre-existent entities within the government. And then on the broader question of how you balance security and industry, I do think that part of the answer there, and I'm going to repeat myself a million times on this, but is balancing defensive actions with proactive ones. You can support industry and support US and allied industry while at the same time seeking to protect it. There's just this bias or limitation within so much of the precedent in terms of US policy where we focus exclusively on the defensive measures that don't do industry any good, but do restrict action.
So, well, that's an interesting concept around standing up a new regulatory body. My friends in the regulatory policy world, we could take a whole day on that question, but that's an interesting concept. Will, I want to go to you and tee up that, you may have seen the United States U.S.-China Commission released a report, I think it was last week, where they made a kind of critique of BIS, where they said, well, there are requirements from 2018 around needing to set up, these lists for foundational and emerging technologies, as Stephen alluded to. I'm curious around your thoughts on that, and whether you think BIS is equipped to do that, and then your thoughts on this question around balance.
Yeah, great question. On the balance point, so BIS's mission statement says very clearly that their priority and their paramount goal is to protect national security, and I think that's sort of important to underscore. I realize that there are competing interests here, but ultimately that is BIS's goal, not. It's not to balance the two. It's to protect U.S. national security. To your broader question, I guess maybe going back to Emily's point about commerce being a reasonable home for BIS. I think I agree with that claim, especially because so much semiconductor, at least in the area of semiconductor policy, so much is happening in commerce also. So there's a real need for coordination of both promotion on the one hand and the more protection kind of policy that BIS does. So I'm actually fairly happy with commerce being the home for BIS for right now. But of course there's a need to. I think there are other things that we need to do, as Emily was alluding to ward off the creep of industry concerns. But on the other hand, a deep understanding of the industry is actually important for making export controls very effective. And ultimately, it's not in the interest of national security to undermine U.S. Competitiveness. So, yeah, those are my thoughts.
So, Stephen, I was hoping that you would give us some of your insight around innovation leadership, and that also has to do with individuals and the roles. I mean, we know that many companies, many organizations, their success can come down to great leaders. And I was hoping that you would give me your thoughts around what you feel the new leader would need at BIS. What kind of skills would be necessary?
Sure. With just a short preface. On December 11th, 2001, China ceded to the World Trade Organization. And my organization, ITIF, will have a report coming out in just a few weeks that assesses China's adherence to its WTO commitments over the past 20 years. And, spoiler alert, we'll find that this is a nation that is just fundamentally, not adhered to the, foundational tenets or spirit of the law of the WTO. And again, that highlights the need for an across-the-government strategy to deal with the China challenge, everything from SOEs, enterprises and subsidies to tech transfer and intellectual property theft issues. So I just make that point because while certainly the director of BIS will be critically important, this individual needs to be implementing a coordinated, effective, coherent China policy that is originating from the National Security Council in a process that integrates the respective expertise of all key agencies, from commerce to state to defense, et cetera. So I think the notion that this individual is going to set China policy, the reality may be more that this individual will be implementing a China policy developed across the U.S. government. But in terms of the characteristics, of the individual, I think it's important to recognize, this is a sprawling agency with over 450 people who manage a process of 40,000 export control licenses a year, thousands of classification requests, and an appeals process. We really need an expert in export control policy. Somebody with a strong command of export control law and regulations, and who can manage a clear, timely, effective, transparent process of running in the agency. It's important to recognize that the effective operation of this agency and managing the licenses it grants or does not grant is actually vitally important to the competitiveness of U.S. technology companies. So that's one attribute, I think. It would be nice to have somebody with a deep expertise with China as well, and the challenges that China does present. Also, I think it's important to have somebody with strong diplomatic and communication skills, because if we do seriously want a multilateral export control process conducted in coordination with allies, we need somebody who can bring the skills to the table. I won't venture a guess on who it might be, Rosalind. I know you were hoping that the announcement might occur during our session today. You did get the supply chain report released from the White House. I hope you'll be content with that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yes, that would be quite something. So, well, let's. I want to dive into a topic that is certainly mentioned in the White House report, and it's something that that you guys have written on. I think all three of you have highlighted, but it's one of these companies, YMTC, which is a Chinese military fab. It has quite a quotation in the White House. Let me just find it. Bear with me 1 second. It was mentioning YMTC. Sorry. Right, page 60 on the report. China memory projects are the most mature of all of its efforts across the semiconductor spectrum. YMTC, a subsidiary of Tsinghua Unigroup, is emerging as China's national champion memory chip producer. Even though YMTC's 3D NAND memory technology is untested and significantly less advanced, it still represents a watershed moment. Especially because the company was only founded in 2016. It's received an estimated $24 billion in subsidies from the Chinese government, which is likely going to help its rapid development. So this is, sort of what we're dealing with. And, you've got full power of Chinese government and military, all the money, standing up fabs like YMTC. It was highlighted by the Nikkei publication last week. So and one of the challenges, U.S. companies are heavily involved with YMTC, notably leading companies, Applied Materials, KLA, Lam Research. They're actually making the means of production of semiconductors, this actual equipment, this SME, semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So how do we go forward in this particular issue? Obviously the White House has laid out that this is something that needs to be addressed. And both of you mentioned it in your reports, actually all three. So maybe Emily, you would start with your thoughts.
I mean, I risk starting by saying that it's not just YMTC, which might be an unproductive place to start, but great that we're identifying this company. It's not the only one. There are other problematic companies in the same category, like Changshin Memory. There are also companies all across the semiconductor value chain, whether that's in storage or RF chips or connectors and antennae, that are equally propped up and potentially equally connected, for example, to PLA entities. And regardless, that are like state champions intended to erode this value chain. And this goes back to how you began the conversation with the idea that our piecemeal efforts risk allowing China to find workarounds. As long as we're just focused on one company or on a list of companies, there are going to be workarounds. And so it would probably be more productive for us to look at the organizing forces for these, or at least coordinating nodes. So YMTC is backed by Tsinghua Unigroup. That might be a more productive place to start, because if you focus there, you have less risk of having just a different company, the same company under a different name pop up. Or, for example, focusing on the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, which is a government guidance fund in China focused on propping up this industry. But regardless, looking at the government entities that are deploying this industrial policy in the semiconductor domain or any strategic domain rather than the symptoms.
That's great. What about you, Will? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the idea of treating the causes rather than the symptoms. And I was thinking about Lam, KLA, Applied Materials. So these are the more upstream companies that you were referring to, and these are. I worry actually quite a bit about how these companies are responding to export controls. I'm especially worried about the uncertainty that recent export controls, especially unilateral export controls, create for companies like these that are, ultimately selling quite a bit of their equipment to companies in China. So just to give a couple examples, Applied Materials claims that 50% of their manufacturing happens in Singapore currently. That's probably a bad outcome for the United States. It's a U.S. company, but producing quite a bit of its very valuable technology in Singapore now. The same thing, you can see it in other parts of the supply chain. So there's a Japanese photoresist suppliers. That's another sort of very important advanced material for semiconductor manufacturing. They've moved some of their production to South Korea, ostensibly to ward off the possibility of export controls interrupting their exports. So I'm thinking quite a bit about this possibility of kind of upstream implications from downstream export controls. I think ultimately, and we're kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but the more multilateral, more rules-based approach that hopefully the Biden administration is going to deliver on is a really important way of increasing that level of certainty and reducing the fear that our company might be next. So that's just to sort of underscore Emily's point about treating causes and looking elsewhere in the supply chain as well.
Right. Well, I think this also reflects, when we come back to the balance issue, I mean, if you look at over the Trump administration, I think something like 300 Chinese entities were added to the entity list, and many more, also hundreds from other countries as well. Biden administration has added 7 companies just in the last couple of months. So, on the one hand, maybe the argument in favor of that is, you need to define the company, you have to use a rule of law instrument. But then the other hand is, does this scale? And I think maybe the question with YMTC, that it is such clearly defined. I mean, if you look at one of the nominees for this position, a guy like James Mulvinon, he wrote the definitive report about YMTC and documented all of the links to the Chinese military and all of the ways it was evading WTO and so forth. So it's sort of like, why is this company not already identified and on the list? We're going month after month. So it's an interest, certainly would be a good question to Emily's point. But maybe, Will, would you clarify for me, and I'd love Stephen to weigh in on this, that, I think something else the White House points out, there is a challenge for American companies. They want to, China's a big market. They need to sell. This is who's buying. They just want to, they have to supply their shareholders. They need to sell their equipment to make money.
If I
and so how, yeah.
On that point, Rosalind,
sure, please.
As simple as, the shareholders.
Yeah.
I think the reality is in semiconductors, we're fundamentally dealing with the world's most important industry,
Right.
even maybe beyond biotech in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis. But we've seen this, when Detroit loses as much as 20% of its auto production in the first part of the year, it matters greatly. And it's an industry that today, in reality, is the world's most capital and R&D intensive, where it costs $20 billion to launch a new fab, and the cost of moving to that next generation of semiconductor technology from 7 to 5 to 3 nanometer doubles every time. So the reality is that economies of scale matter greatly in this industry. Certainly China, Taiwan, the US understand that. But it does mean fundamentally that the profits from one generation of semiconductor innovation are crucial to reinvest in that next generation of semiconductor innovation. And also that every dollar that a US company earns in China, whether it's selling semiconductors or selling semiconductor manufacturing equipment, is a dollar that a Chinese company doesn't get to have, and that we get to reinvest in future generations of innovation. So therefore, it is crucially important, while that yes, we certainly do balance understanding any types of technologies that are feeding into the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to confer upon China distinct military advantage and impose export controls on those types of technologies, but that we not implement a regime that cuts off the ability of U.S. companies to sell into commercial marketplaces, especially when there's readily foreign made equipment available to service those needs. And that's why it's important that our export control regime do be extremely nuanced and do balance the competing interest of national security and commercial interest.
I think that's a great point. Will, I wanted to come back to you, highlight something you described in your report. You talked about Japan, how they were able through reverse engineering, technology transfer over a period of 15 years to catch up with the US. And you described some of those aspects today with China. So I wonder, do we have a kind of a similar setup if US firms are maybe engaging with these military fabs? Are we in fact empowering them with the capabilities of the means of production to become self-sufficient?
So there's some truth to that. I think another angle on it, which I'm partial to. So Japan, one reason that they were able to do so well in the semiconductor manufacturing equipment industry, which is supplying semiconductor manufacturers, is that they had a very well-developed at that time or rapidly growing semiconductor manufacturing industry that was buying from their equipment makers. So I actually think that there is an argument for the upstream export controls that we've been talking about on things like manufacturing equipment. If you can get those right, for example, let's say you partner with Japan and the Netherlands on something very narrow like photolithography equipment, very advanced photolithography equipment. If you can do that and make sure that actually China does not use subsidies in order to displace US firms at the leading edge, you can actually have ecosystem-wide effects on China's semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, and that in turn can affect things like their ability to build manufacturing equipment firms that are supplying those companies. So I think it's important to think about it as an ecosystem, and if we can apply these very narrow export controls on the inputs like photolithography equipment, that might hurt U.S. companies a little bit in the long run. But I think in the short term, sorry, but in the long run, I think there are actually real benefits to those same companies. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Well, we've had a couple of audience questions roll in, so I want to give us an opportunity to address some of those. We have one particular questions coming in saying, who will get the job of Under Secretary for Export Control, which oversees BIS? So this person would like you to venture your prediction.
I'm not going to venture an opinion. I will say that, as I understand, the administration is currently undergoing an active process of vetting candidates for the position.
Okay, great. Well, I want to say that, just to remind our viewers, you can go to chinatechthreat.com/future-BIS, and we have profiled 5 potential nominees there. They have contributed to various views, so you can, and we don't take a position on any of those, although we just try to highlight them for people can read for themselves, give those people an opportunity to share their thoughts. Emily, how about, if you could wave the magic wand, who is your dream BIS Undersecretary?
I'm going to plead the fifth here. It's not going to be me. I know that.
Okay. Well, that's too bad. I would put you up there.
I can say what I think should characterize this person.
Please.
I would like somebody who can think differently than we have in the past, and who is not caught in old frameworks about how things work or about how individual competitors work, because that seems to have been a problem in much of our policy in the past. And somebody who's willing to advance a proactive vision for U.S. industry in conjunction, again, to beat this dead horse with allies and partners. I think that would be fantastic if I had a magic wand.
Yeah, I also don't want to weigh in, but I do think that there's somewhat of a tension there between the desire to have someone who, has a new vision and can think very differently, and also that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the fact that this is going through such a time of transition already and is expanding its responsibilities so much. It seems like a hard job to give anyone, to both bring in a radically new vision, but also be sort of working on scaling up the resources and capabilities of BIS to meet like the current challenges that I would say it's currently not fully able to handle. So just to give an example of that, deemed export control licenses. So these are the licenses for they're not export controls on technology itself, but rather basically companies need permission for foreign nationals who are working in the United States to have access to certain sensitive U.S. technology. Right now, there's been a lot of backlogs on approving those applications, and that's largely because of the expansion of the remit of BIS. So you want to, on the one hand, have someone who has that forward vision and a good idea of what might come next for BIS, but on the other hand, you do need someone who, as Stephen said, knows the law very well, understands the industry, the capabilities of BIS very deeply, and is able to just, I would say, scale up from where BIS currently is, which is, I think, still trying to wrap its arms around the challenge of meeting China.
I'll just also add that there's a backlog of 70 staff unfulfilled positions at the agency. There's a backlog, you said, of the export control request. Also, I understand, at the last NAR, the multilateral control regime, they're backed up there largely, especially because of COVID-19. So, it's important that the viewers from Congress on this call do understand the importance of this agency, and that the nomination process for whoever it is does proceed apace and smoothly, because, as I said earlier, the effective functioning of this agency itself is critical to the competitiveness of our tech industries. That
is such an excellent point. Because it isn't just one person. Well, I had myself a debate a little bit with the Economist magazine. They had made I wrote a letter to the editor, which was published, and Economist magazine was saying, well, we needed essentially a bureaucrat, which was a sort of a lawyer with a kind of fealty to, government and the department and so on. And I can certainly respect that because, Washington is a rule of law town. But on the other hand, I think that this is it's also a bit of a diminishment of understanding, just as you're saying, Stephen, the importance of this. This is also about leadership, and it's a critical moment. I mean, it's no different than in the 1950s when we were looking at beginning, the Cold War with Soviet Union and the space program. So this is that kind of moment. If we take seriously if semiconductors is supposed to be the most important industry in the world, and what is the role of this agency in facilitating that. So you can see my letter to the editor where I said, that this person could come from a number of fields, from security, could come from law, could come from scientific and technical backgrounds, but it may need a combination. And I would certainly agree, it's not just the undersecretary, it's also the bench, it's also the staff of people that are needed. But I would also agree, yeah, go ahead, please.
Just to interject that I love your taking on The Economist, and I wish you would also write to them to explain that intellectual property and intellectual property rights are important to enable innovation across high-tech industries, a topic the Economist doesn't always seem to fully understand. But just to expand upon—
I'm with you on that. Listen, I'm 100%. We can do a joint letter to them, Stephen, no problem.
That might be more about patents and trade secrets. but just to add on to your point and when Emily made earlier, about new thinking and new creativity. We've all talked about the multilateral approach, but to put a slightly finer point on it, we released a report last year called An Allied Approach to Semiconductor Leadership, where we talked about how like-minded nations can collaborate around activities such as semiconductor technology development, semiconductor technology protection, to kind of collectively advance our communal semiconductor ecosystems forward in a competitive way against nations that aren't going to play by the rules. But one recommendation we had in that report is that we fundamentally reimagine the export control regime around semiconductors by establishing a small plurilateral or minilateral of only those nations that are involved at the highest levels of semiconductor production capacity on both the manufacturing equipment and semiconductor side. So a fundamentally new approach to imagining how we implement semiconductor export controls with our closest allies, I think, will be a key test of leadership for such a new individual.
That's a great point. So, in addition to someone who knows how this works, also being able to be a diplomat or to be a team leader, to work with others. And I think your point as well, Stephen, if we look at export controls, they are very time-consuming and cumbersome, requiring all these different nations to work together. If there's a way to fast-track that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let me just go into the lightning round. If you're going to be on the Senate Finance Committee that will be looking at this nominee to head BIS, what question are you going to ask that nominee? So we're going to start with you, Will.
Great. I would ask how would you leverage how will you leverage private sector knowledge, supply chain knowledge, technical expertise to make export controls and BIS more effective?
Emily, what about you?
I thought for a second Will had taken my question, and it's effectively the same thing. But how will you engage with the private sector to encourage both security and developing competitive advantages for the U.S.? And it may say a lot that we're both talking about how there's going to be public-private partnership here.
So, and I'm going to say, excuse me, I meant to say Senate Banking Committee, not Senate Finance, but Senate Banking is where this nominee is vetted. Stephen, what question?
I'd be interested to know if he would come up with kind of developing a new semiconductor export control regime with a select group of like-minded nations, and how he would go about, or she would go about, managing such a process of creating an entirely new approach to export control regulation in the sector.
So great. Well, I hope that the staffers of that committee are watching today and will take note of these questions. We've covered a lot of ground, panel. Really appreciate it. Is there any other point that you wanted to make today that you didn't have a chance to make? I'd love to give you an opportunity to do that.
I'd love to jump in and just note that in every one of our questions, we just pointed to the Washington not being sufficient in its own right, and there being a need for work that takes place in conjunction with other governments and also with the private sector. And I don't that would probably be my one strongest takeaway from just about everything I work on, but also this conversation. That part of the challenge today is that nothing Washington does alone is sufficient, and that's going to have to define every one of these efforts moving forward.
Stephen, do you have any other industry we can look at where you think that there's something to learn?
So ITIF will have an event on Thursday where we looked at kind of the impact of China's innovation mercantilist practices across 5 high-tech industries, also including high-speed rail, biotechnology, solar panels, and some, as well as semiconductors. And you mentioned the stat we had that essentially China's support and subsidization of inferior industries took market share from more innovative companies that we estimate, if you look at the shares of R&D and patenting, it might have cost our like-minded countries' firms 5,000 patents. But if I might, I think there's a larger challenge we haven't quite yet touched upon yet. And certainly our companies need to be able to sell into China. But there's a more fundamental challenge, in my opinion, which is that over the long term, China doesn't buy into the WTO notion of comparative advantage. That nations specialize in production of what they're best at, and they trade for things. China wants absolute advantage in all advanced technology industries, including semiconductors. And clearly, the intent of its national integrated circuit semiconductor strategy, it says clearly it wants to, by the year 2025, decrease foreign imports of semiconductors by half and eliminate them entirely by 2035. China wants autarky in this critical industry. That's a fundamental challenge, to the entire global trading system, to the WTO, to our companies. Finding creative ways to deal with China's long-term intent to denude the ability of our companies to compete in this sector is a critical challenge. And one response we're going to have isn't just a multilateral export control regime. It's going to be to increase the size of markets of like-minded countries. That means, in my opinion, getting the U.S. back in TPP, deepening trade relations with India. We need to create marketplaces for our companies to be able to sell into that create an alternative to China, especially if their long-term strategy is to not let our companies sell into their market.
Excellent. Will, any final thoughts?
I think what Emily said tied it all together very nicely. Just that BIS is not operating in a vacuum, and it's more important now, I think, than ever before for, I would add, even interagency operation plus public-private partnerships plus allied collaboration. I think there's also an important, we need to have dialogue, as I started to mention earlier, between the protect side, which is really BIS's focus, and the promotion side. So for example, we have, the United States is dumping $50 billion or so into promoting semiconductor manufacturing within the US. At the same time, you have South Korea putting hundreds of billions of dollars into their semiconductor manufacturing, and then you have the same thing happening in Taiwan, and so there is this ratcheting up of promotion efforts that are ultimately fairly zero sum. So I think that just underscores that whenever we're working with such complicated, rapidly emerging technologies and supply chains, you're never operating alone. And that's definitely a theme coming out of this conversation.
Well, thank you. I want to thank our excellent panel for the discussion, and also to thank you, the many attendees, for joining us today. Be sure to check out the Future of BIS website at chinatechthreat.com. You will find links to the papers from today's discussion and other materials, and you can also find an archive of today's event. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.